but they're not supposed to talk about it.
So, the firemen aren't supposed to talk about it.
Poltergeist is a 1982 film directed by Tobe Hooper. It was written and produced by Steven Spielberg and follows a suburban family experiencing strange events seemingly caused by ghosts, whose daughter eventually disappears. It has an unusual structure and features themes that are common in many of Hooper's other works. There are two elements outside of the text itself that bear discussion before getting into the film proper. The first is the controversy over who actually directed the film, as there have been persistent rumors that Spielberg was actually in charge, but due to a contract with Universal Studios that prevented him from directing any other films while working on E.T., he had to find someone else to take credit. There are a few pieces of evidence that point to this. The first is from the man himself, who discussed the film in an interview with the LA Times, saying that Tobe isn't a take charge sort of guy. If a question was asked and an answer wasn't immediately forthcoming, I'd jump in and say what we could do. Tobe would nod agreement, and that became the process of collaboration. This was in addition to other interviews where Spielberg talked about how much impact he had on the film. Co-producer Frank Marshall said that he was the creative force behind the film, doing all of the storyboards and being on set every day. Hooper contradicted this, saying it was closer to an even split, with him doing half and Spielberg doing the other. Zelda Rubinstein, who played the paranormal investigator Tangina, claimed that Spielberg directed all 6 days she was on set, while Hooper would set up shots, Spielberg would make adjustments. She also claimed Hooper was high or otherwise incapacitated during both the audition process and filming. These complaints have never been corroborated. Finally, the first assistant cameraman, John Leonetti, said that Spielberg directed the film and Hooper was just happy to be there. However, other cast and crew, including James Karen, Martin Casella, Oliver Robbins, and Mick Garris, all said that Hooper was firmly the only director. It appears that the reality is that it wasn't a black and white situation. Spielberg was a heavily involved producer, being on set most days and having veto power over things like props. This was Hooper's first big-budget production, and Spielberg had just come off incredibly successful films like Close Encounters of the Third Kind and Raiders of the Lost Ark, so he understandably ceded to Spielberg's ideas. However, the film has many elements that are prevalent in all of Hooper's filmography. This includes the broader themes, and the satirical look at the American family. Spielberg's films are all extremely earnest, without any particularly biting commentary. And while some of that comes down to the script, it's also the way scenes are shot. Take, for example, when Carol Ann is staring at the static TV. Her face is an inch away from the glass. Her mother comes up, says it's bad for her, then changes it to a war film. This satirizes the American belief that violence is acceptable for children, but other relatively innocuous things are not. Other motifs that occur in much of Hooper's other films include children in danger, useless or outright hostile authority figures, the death of hippie culture, and critiques of capitalism. While certainly some of these can be seen in other Spielberg productions, they are much less the focus, whereas Hooper keeps returning to them. The other, more ephemeral quality is that the film feels like a Tobe Hooper film. It's certainly not as gonzo as some of his earlier works, as he reined himself in for wider audiences, but the way the characters act feels similar to his other films. Consider Diane's response to chairs in her house suddenly moving. At first there is confusion and fear, but immediately turns to interest and amusement, playing games with the ghosts. This is extremely atypical for the genre, and immediately tells the audience this isn't going to be like other paranormal films, such as the Amityville Horror. The humor throughout the film is similarly Hooper's style. Characters joke, but more often it's simply the outrageous circumstances which the humor is derived from. One of the paranormal investigators described a toy slowly moving across a room over a period of 7 hours as one of the most significant events he had seen. Steve shrugs, then opens the door to his children's room, revealing utter chaos, with objects flying around in a wicked spiral. Hooper also had involvement from the very beginning of the project, including the scriptwriting and the basic ideas. It is ultimately Hooper's film with a large influence from Steven Spielberg. There is a second meta element associated with the film, or rather the franchise. When the topic of cursed films comes up, this is often the top of the list. The supposed curse is due to the infamous pool scene, when a number of skeletons appear, as the house in the film was built on top of a graveyard, where they moved the gravestones but left the bodies. The skeletons were confirmed to be real bones, as it was cheaper to source them from India rather than construct fake ones. Similar production design occurred in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which also largely used real parts. Unfortunately, several members of the cast died extremely young. Dominique Dunne, who played the teenage child of the family, was killed by her ex-boyfriend 6 months after the film premiered. Heather O'Rourke, who played Carol Ann, died while filming the third Poltergeist film, due to congenital stenosis at the age of only 12. Both cases are extremely tragic, but saying they had anything to do with the film is absurd. Another factor that people used to back up the existence of a curse is that 2 of the stars of Poltergeist 2, Will Sampson and Julian Beck, died shortly after the release of that film. However, both actors were sick prior to being cast, scleroderma and stomach cancer respectively, and neither death was particularly a surprise. Beck's gaunt appearance in the second film is largely due to chemotherapy, which is why he appears almost skeletal. Again, it is sad that the actors died soon after the film's release, but any talks of a curse are merely attempts to enforce order in what is ultimately a chaotic and frightening world. Relating that to the text, despite being focused around the other side and ghosts, Poltergeist is ultimately a secular film. There is no attempt at an exorcism or even religious paraphernalia in the solution for the ghosts. It is more scientific, attempting to understand what are effectively alien creatures, rather than appealing to a higher power. That is only one of the ways in which the film is atypical, however, as the structure bears special mention. The beginning of the film is fairly typical. It establishes the characters, the setting, it has the inciting incident of digging out the swimming pool. The iconic television scene then happens, with Carol Ann proclaiming, "The next day seems normal. Then the chairs are supernaturally moved, then stacked on the table. At first Diane seems frightened, then in the next scene she's positively ecstatic. The events are treated like a fun diversion, something to mess around with, but ultimately harmless. No characters question their existence, they simply accept it. The next night things escalate, with their son being attacked by a tree and Carol Ann disappearing. That's the end of the first act, and while there have been more traditional elements, the reactions to the supernatural are very different than normal. It then cuts to some time later, when Stephen seeks out a team of paranormal investigators to help. What's interesting is the time jump has caused a huge deterioration in the family. Dan has bags over his eyes and is drinking while guiding the team through his house. Diane is able to hold it together, but only by being problem-oriented, working to fix the case of her missing daughter, putting aside all the emotions until after it's solved. What's also interesting is how acclimated the family are to the supernatural events. Lights flicker and things fly across the room, and they don't care, dismissing it as a fact of life. The investigators are far more disturbed, although eventually they're able to assist in at least recording the phenomena. After things escalate, they send away their son and bring in Tangina, an expert. Her presence in the film is short, but defines the film. She immediately knows what to do, and they manage to pull off a rescue of Carol Ann, despite some contradictory instructions. She then proclaims,
"This house is clean."
Everyone packs up to move, and it seems like the film is over. However, it is not. There is a final explosive finale, where the house does its best to kill the remaining occupants. The final sequence has some of the most iconic images from the film, and is extremely effective, despite being almost a postscript, past where the film could have ended. Tangina is merely one example of one of the best features of the film, its characters. While Dana unfortunately comes up short in terms of screen time and dimensions, the rest of the cast feel fully developed. Even the parapsychologists who appear briefly have defined personalities, with one fleeing the house after the events become too much. This creates an emotional anchor for the film that allows for us to still care even when the fantastical elements take over. Stephen and Diane, the parents of the family, have what seems to be a healthy dynamic. They smoke weed and make jokes together. Stephen is significantly older, and based on Dana's age, it seems like this is his second marriage, or at least long-term relationship, but it never seems to be an issue. It's clear they both love their children, and go through literal hell in order to protect them. As discussed previously, they have unique reactions to the supernatural experiences that again make them feel less like film characters and more like real people, in a somewhat paradoxical manner. Carol Ann, whose rescue becomes the driving force behind the narrative, could have been a standard creepy kid archetype. She seems to have some connection to the spirits that inhabit the house, likely because she was born in it. She talks to them through the TV and can seemingly hear their responses. However, aside from these few moments, she acts like an average 5-year-old, cheerfully playing with toys or teasing her brother. Even when talking to the ghosts, she's still mostly happy, treating them as just another occupant of the house. Unlike the Omen or the Children of the Corn, she's not malevolent or monotone, but simply a child dealing with a strange situation. Even after she's rescued, she seems none the worse for wear, eagerly playing with her brother, bouncing back from a difficult experience with the resilience that many children have. Her performance was lauded by critics, a rare occurrence for a child actor. In general, the film was well received critically, and went on to significant commercial success, making approximately $120 million on a $10 million budget, which would end up being Hooper's second most successful film after Chainsaw. The film would eventually lead to 2 sequels and a remake, although none had anywhere near the popularity, acclaim, or success as the original, although they did expand on the lore behind the house. Despite this, there are rumors of a new remake and a television series in the pipeline, although it's unclear whether either will actually amount to anything. The film's style would be a big influence on other sci-fi horror pictures like White Noise or The Ring. Some scenes would also be replicated in other films, with The Nightmare on Elm Street's gravity-defying first kill almost certainly being inspired by the actions in the final part of this one. Poltergeist was certainly a mixed film for Hooper himself. The filming was easier in some ways than his earlier projects, with much of the pressure taken off him because of Spielberg's presence, but on the other hand, he had much less freedom than usual, and the controversies following its release certainly took somewhat of a toll on him. The film was also the only one that Hooper worked on that was nominated for an Academy Award, albeit for technical categories. It didn't win any, but it's still a significant accomplishment. The picture is somewhat of an anomaly in terms of its subject matter. While it's still firmly horror, it is really the only part of Hooper's filmography that deals with specters or ghosts, and relies heavily on special effects in the way this film does. While he has worked on films with other types of undead, zombies, vampires, and the like, they were all slightly more grounded, whereas Poltergeist goes truly wild with alternate dimensions and the TV people. Poltergeist is one of Hooper's best films, and remains as effective today as it was 4 decades ago. It builds on a strong foundation with themes about the greed of corporations and familial bonds that are timeless, and delivers something that is incredibly unique. With memorable characters and a solid pace, it remains one of the best Halloween party movies they can put on in mixed company and everyone can enjoy something. That's all for today. I hope you've enjoyed, and be well.